So, welcome to this presentation of the article Sensitizing Scenarios, Sensitizing Designer Teams to Theory. And the authors of this paper are myself, Annika Waern, Paulina Rajkowska, Karin Johansson, Jon Back, Jocelyn Spence, Anders Sundnes, Løvlie. And we come from various universities. This paper is about trying to address a problem that's well known from literature, that sometimes designer teams need a shared understanding of also concepts that are very theoretical. And what we are trying to explore in this paper is if we can use artistic role-playing as a way of getting there. When we talk about this, we talk about sensitizing. So sensitizing is not quite the same thing as learning about these concepts. If you're learning about complex theoretical concepts, you're assuming that you somehow get a correct understanding of them. It's learning implies in some sense knowledge transfer. And that's not really what we're looking at here. We're talking about making some of the values and the concepts from theories available to practice, and doing it in a way that that understanding is shared and serves as a way of helping the teams to develop their designs. So the goal here is not to teach theory in a comprehensive way. We're turning to LARP, live role-playing, as a form of experience that potentially these designer teams could do together. And role-playing is good because it lets us empathize with various characters that collaborate or enact a scene together. But what we have to be careful about is that role-playing doesn't necessarily mean that we learn something about how it is to be that person. Stepping into somebody else's shoes doesn't mean that we become that person, and role-playing is not the same as the real experience. So what we're doing here is we're looking upon the role-playing as a bridging experience. And by bridging, we mean the same as you do with bridging concepts and bridging artifacts. That they aren't necessarily, the experience is not necessarily exactly the same for everybody who plays, but it's sufficiently shared so that you afterwards can talk about it, you can analyze it, you can share this together within the designer team. So the first iteration I would like Jocelyn to talk a bit about.
So this first one of the very first role plays we came up with was called Story Builders, and this seemed very straightforward and seemed like it was going to be very successful. We were trying to think about how to get people to feel what it was like to be in a museum context where you would have the curatorial perspective presented to you with labels saying this is what something is and this is what to make of it, and then how it would feel to invite the public in to come up with their own engagements. So we had a game in which everyone started with the same object and they decided what it would represent. So for example, you've got the get a grip here, and everyone would decide that it was actually an ancient artifact from Mesopotamia. And then they would each draw unique other objects, 4 other objects, and have to make a story connecting them. The problem is there were no roles to play. There were no feet to step into in the sense of taking on a certain perspective, not a certain person, but a certain perspective. So we ended up with a lot of intellectual engagement, but nothing affective, nothing emotional. So people didn't feel what it meant to go through this process. So nobody saw the point of it. Nobody saw the point we were getting at about multiple interpretations. So even though it was a good game in some ways, it wasn't a good game for this context.
In the second iteration, I would like Jon back to talk a little bit about what we were doing.
Yeah, it's important to understand that good scenarios might not necessarily mean good for a particular purpose. So in this second scenario that we developed together with curators, the players took on roles making an exhibition and taking on roles with different agendas in that process of making it. The game was played over 1 hour, and they were making this exhibition from idea and meeting with the interest groups to the first opening and on to an ordinary visitor watching the exhibition. And even though this was a deep and emotional experience, it did not feel authentic, especially from a curator perspective. So it was still not accepted for the museum people, even though they were involved in the design process, since it was too simplified. And this is a good game design, but it's not necessarily a good sensitizing scenario.
In the third iteration, we therefore turned our attention towards how can we create this sense of authenticity through the context where the scenarios are played. So the scenarios that we were using in this iteration were considerably simpler than the ones that we had developed before, and also open to changes. And I'm going to let Karin Johansson talk a little bit about this experience.
We ran tests at the two museums, the Museum of Jönköping in Sweden and the Museum of Yugoslavia in Serbia. And during this test, we had a longer workshop for a full-day workshop, and then the sensitizing scenarios was part of the workshop. And we also worked a lot with debrief and also prepare beforehand. We also modified the scenarios so that they would fit where in the design processes the museums were. So this made it more relevant to them. We also worked a lot with the roles so that the roles really felt like roles that might be a part of such a design process. So they were all in different stages of innovative processes for making new exhibitions or new parts of exhibitions. So we tried to work really hard with making it feel relevant to them when we prepared them for the scenarios, and we also changed the scenarios so that they would fit for the specific situation. And here is a quote from a participant. I think that since we often really have this sort of discussions in the museum, it's good to try to see things from other side and make yourself create arguments for that. And this was a good finding, that they really managed to get an emotional connection and feel how another role could feel. For instance, like a play designer or a curator, and get to understand and on an emotional level understand how those roles might have, or what stakes they might have in the process.
So from this whole experience, we can bring out some design principles. How do we make the sensitizing scenarios work as sensitizing exercises? So the first experience we had was that using characters and giving people characters to play is actually very important. The characters have a couple of different functions. They allow for effective engagement, but they also work as alibi, as a way of excusing yourself to behave out of the ordinary. Obviously, the scenarios have to be relevant for the participants and for the ongoing project. But this doesn't mean that you have to put a lot of effort into making the actual scenarios authentic, because the authenticity is much more important when it comes from the participants, and the way that they can bring in their own authentic context is much more important. And finally, we place a lot of the importance on a structured debrief. So it's not just about playing, but also having a concluding discussion where you connect back to what kind of theories did this scenario build upon, and how it becomes, does that become relevant for the project at hand. So I'm going to let our project coordinator, Anders Sundnes Løvlie, have the last words of this presentation.
So these scenarios were developed as part of an European project funded by Horizon 2020, and the project was called GIFT and focused on hybrid museum experiences. And this formed part of the context for developing the scenarios in collaboration between museums and researchers. The outcomes from the project are all presented on a website called gifting.digital, which provides tools and design recommendations for museum professionals and designers working with museums. And here you can also find the scenarios documented in order to be able to be reused, and they're available under an open source license, so anyone can use them or modify them as needed in their context.
Thank you very much for listening to this presentation.